Okay, so we are concluding um, the discussion of the fourth book of the Torah. And of course, it's Friday, so we want to think a little bit about the Kabbalistic implications of the Parsha and practical implications of the Kabbalistic teachings as well. And the end of the Parsha, at least the final Parsha of the book, there's two portions this week. We spent a lot of time on Tuesday talking about the first of the two, which is the vows, Matot, which begins with the story of the vows. But Masei, the final portion, is the name of the parsha is journeys. These are the journeys. And there's so many ways to look at the amount of teachings that are hidden into this one word because there's so many dimensions. Just a simple one is life is always a journey, right? Because we're listing the 42 places where the people camped. And yet we don't say these are the campings, the places where they rested. We say these are the journeys because the focus is on the journey and the moving forward. So there's a lot to think about here. And I just want to start. I don't think I mentioned this on Tuesday, but it came to me this year, came to me, I got this realization that, there's a very common phrase that everybody uses. You probably saw it in the English translation of the Bible, that the Jews wandered in the desert for 40 years, right? Everyone knows that. I even tried to find a source, but I Googled it. They say, no, there's no one source. It's just popular culture. Everyone knows. If you say wandering in the desert for 40 years, everyone knows you're talking about the Jewish people in the biblical story. Now, of course, the problem is, of course, that the Jewish people never wandered in the desert for 40 years. Um, the problem is with the word wander. Wander, at least by some definitions in the dictionary, there may be others, but some definitions is that wander means it's aimless and it's pointless. And it may look like some of those journeys are aimless and pointless, but I think it's very clear that the Torah is saying it was not aimless and pointless. In fact, we will refer to it um, as the Torah refers to it as journeys. A journey is purposeful. Wandering is aimless and pointless. So Ben writes, there's even a plant, the wandering Jew. Okay, so the wandering Jew is one thing. The Jews, we feel like we're wandering. But I'm saying the Torah does not say the word wandering, it's certainly not in the words of God. And I went back to the portion of Shalach with the spies, and it talks about where God the first time says the Jews are going to be in the desert for 40 years. And I was shocked because even me, I think it says wandering, right? No, it doesn't say wandering. It says your children, meaning the next generation, will shepherd, will pasture their sheep in the desert for 40 years. This doesn't say the word wandering. Rashi is silent on that word. Onkelos says they were delayed, but the wandering translation, which unfortunately seeped in even to the Kahat Chumash, it translates wandering. It doesn't say it anywhere. It doesn't say we're not wandering. What are we doing? We're journeying. That's this week's parsha. It's a journey. It's a journey from Egypt to Israel. And the big idea here is that even though it looks like that some of these steps, it looks like that we're going with setback, and there's a difficulty, and we're actually walking in the wrong direction, right? Somebody once said, "You're on the right path, but you're going the wrong way," right? It doesn't help to be on the right path. It could be on the right train track, but if you're going the wrong way, you're in trouble. So it seems like we're going the wrong way. Sometimes it seems like we're experiencing setback and confusion, and that may be true from our perspective. But the Torah is telling us that the Jewish people in the journey in the desert, but the broader point is the journey of life. We'll talk about this verse, how it applies to the journey of life as a whole. And the Torah is here saying that no, that we're talking about a journey which is journey forward and a journey to growth and positivity and certainly meaning, and certainly not aimless and pointless. So that is sort of a little bit of an introduction to get us in the mood. Now, I also want to say, I don't think I said this on Tuesday. I'm going to share the screen, the second verse of this week's parsha. So I'm going to read the first and second verse, then we're going to read the Rashi of the first verse, and then we'll look at the Rebbe's essay. So if you look at the first verse, these are the journeys of the children of Israel who left the land of Egypt in the legions under the charge of Moses and Aaron. Beautiful. So we're going to list all the places that they settled and traveled. That starts in verse 3, and goes all the way down to list 42 places. Look at the second verse. Now, this problem with the second verse is the second verse seems repetitive. I'm not sure what the whole verse, I guess it's saying Moshe wrote it down, but it's repetitive. There's two clauses in the verse. It seems like it's saying the same thing, just in a different order. So what do we have here? Moses recorded their starting points for their journeys according to the word of the Lord. Motza Ehem. There's different interpretations of what Motza Ehem could mean. Motza Ehem could mean the occurrences, Motza, what happened to them, could also mean the starting point. Here they're translating starting point. So Moses recorded their starting points, meaning where they began for their journeys according to the word of the Lord. Now, if I'm writing this verse, I stop right here because the second clause is repetitive. What does the second clause say? And these were their journeys with their starting points. What is this adding? These were the journeys with their starting points. So there's different ways of thinking about this verse. All the Kabbalists and all the Hasidic commentators have what to say. I just want to say one simple point. In other words, not that it's simple, profound point, but I'm just saying it's only addressing one detail of this verse. Every detail here could be analyzed. This comes from the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, and recorded by his grandson. And he says like this. He says, there's two clauses in the verse. The first, the difference, there's the order changes, but a very important difference between the two clauses of the verse is the words, Al Pi Hashem, according to the word of the Lord. Right? In the beginning of the statement is Moses recorded their starting points to their journeys according to the word of the Lord. The second clause, and these were their journeys with their starting points, does not say according to the word of the Lord. What's the difference? So he says that the second clause is the human perspective. The second clause is when we look back at our journey, you look back at your life up to this point, and you don't necessarily always see that every station was by the word of the Lord. You could say some of them are my mistakes. Some of them are things that I did I should not have done. Some of those things I went against God's will. You may think that. And that's true from your perspective. But what the first clause of the verse says is Moses, if you look at Moses' perspective, Moses could see how all these are these journeys, every stop on your journey is according to the word of the Lord. According to the word of the Lord means that Hashem orchestrates this so that something positive can come out of it, and it therefore could be defined as a journey, not as distraction or being lost or wandering. Wandering is the worst because at least negativity is not purposeless. Wandering is purposeless. We're allergic to the word wandering. But in any case, the point here is it's basically this verse is showing that there could be two perspectives to life, and both are true. Is the human perspective what we see, and we don't always see how everything is purposeful, but we believe that from Hashem's perspective, everything is purposeful. And now we're going to be able to go back and read the first Rashi and see how to apply this to our life and how to think about this in general, about the metaphors and specific metaphors that Rashi brings, and what that teaches us about life in general and God's presence in the world and how we see the divine presence in the world when we do, when we don't. So there are a lot of big ideas here because we're talking about a big subject, which is not just there's the journey of the Jewish people from the land of Egypt to the promised land, but that is also a paradigm, as the Baal Shem Tov teaches, to every single person's life also has these travelings from the Egypt, which is the narrow straits, which is the womb, and then you come out, and then you travel to the promised land, and you travel through the 42 steps, and these are 42 steps in your journey, and everybody has them a little bit different, but everybody has those 42 steps, and then how to think about them and how to appreciate them. So it's not just a story of the past, but it's very much a story that is ongoing. So that is a little bit of the introduction to think about where we're heading and why this is so important and why it's practical, because we want to think about our own life and our own journey. So this is by way of introduction. Comments, questions are welcome. Otherwise, we jump right in. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. This is a very deep idea. Of course, we're never wandering in our lives.
Right.
But at the beginning, it may seem like it, right? At the beginning, it may seem like it. So going back to number 40, after 40 years, when Moses actually wrote it, like a reframing in retrospect, what does that number 40 what does it do to our maturing of understanding of our trajectory in life?
Yeah, so you mentioned reframing. We're going to talk about reframing because even though it's a modern word, but we'll see in a minute that Rashi is clearly, the Medrash clearly is referring to reframing. And we'll talk about that element when we get to Rashi. But the number 40 represents the certain level of maturity, right? We know the Talmud says that a person does not understand the ultimate depth of his teacher until 40 years. And so this 40 years is also another number, which is a Kabbalistic number, which is 42. And Shem Mab, one of God's names, is equals the number 42. And the point here is, if you count this 7 sefirot, 7 times 7 is 49. But if you do 6 times 7 is 42. So in some ways, 42 is the complete sefirot that is within the person himself, because the 7th sefirah is speech, is projecting it outward. So in other words, there's a certain maturity that happens, the refinement, inner refinement that happens without malchut. And malchut essentially, either, we're not counting it because it's reflecting outward, or another way to think about this is malchut is like the moon. It doesn't have its speech, it just receives from the inner faculties. So you don't have to talk about it, because if you refine all the inner sefirot, then by definition, malchut is refined, because malchut is a projector of what's happening inside, or the ability to project. So there are different ways to think about why malchut is not counted, but the bottom line is that the 42 journeys represent the full refinement of the 6 sefirot, how each sefirah includes 7. Or maybe, yeah, I think that's what it is. It could be it's 7 sefirot, each one includes 6, but no, but I think it's 6 sefirot, each one includes 7. I think that's what it is. And malchut is either there by automatically, or malchut is a separate discussion of how you interact with the world outside of you. And meanwhile, the first 6 are your inner workings, your inner life, your inner spiritual state.
Beautiful, thank you. So it does connect to the Sefirot, at least to
Yes, 42. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
years of one.
So 40 and 42, I don't know how that lines up. 40 could be other numbers. 40 is associated with Bina. Bina could be 40. Bina could be 40. Also, 40 is intellectual maturity, because we're talking about a full, so 10 is the complete number. So 4 times 10. And then we talk about what does the number 4 represent. So there's 3 intellectual sefirot, wisdom, understanding, knowledge. So that's 3. But often the 3 become 4, because dat, knowledge, becomes the source, is the parent which gives birth. Well, father and mother is wisdom and understanding, and they give birth, and through the union, which is dat, they give birth to children. And the children really include 2, chesed and gevura, love and discipline, because really, essentially, that is the two that is the 2 main emotional sefirot. The main 2 emotions is either kindness and love, which is flowing outward, trying to connect, or holding back. If a person is fearful, or a person is retreating, that's going inward. So essentially, if you want to talk about a number that will include the spiritual refinement of the mind and the emotions, number 40 would be 4 times 10. 10 is complete. And then 40 represents, you have the awareness, with the different parts of the awareness, wisdom, understanding, knowledge. And you also have the product of the healthy awareness, which would be love and would be respect, or love and discipline, or love and fear, call it what you want. So that's where you get the number 40 from.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ben, please.
Yeah, you talked about how, it's a wandering 40, or not a wandering, a purposeful journey for 40 years, and, to the promised land. But Moses didn't get into the promised land. And
Right.
so how does that relate to our life journey, the way you just talked about it, which is that this represents how, the purposeful problems and issues and trials and tribulations that we deal with, but we may not make it to the promised land in the end, in this metaphor, or whatever you want to call it.
So what I would say is we're reaching our promised land, maybe not the promised land. In other words, every person has their own mission and their own level that they're going to achieve throughout their lifetime. Then there's the collective promised land of all of humanity, which is what they call the Messianic era, which is just a fancy name to say when the world reaches perfection. And there's wisdom in the world, and there's kindness, and there's abundance. So that is separate. That is collective. So when you say Moshe did not enter the promised land, it means Moshe did not merit to see the collective story of the Jewish people reach completion. But his own personal story reaches completion. And everybody in our own life, there's the collective story. We're part of a collective, but we also have a personal mission and a personal story. And we're definitely a person. Hopefully this is connected. Yeah. So the person, I could say, we could say that a person at the end of their life reaches the promised land, certainly in a spiritual sense. And according to the Kabbalah, Yarden Yurecha is the Jordan River, but opposite Jericho. Jericho represents scent, smell. The word reach, smell, comes from that's the word for Yericho, Jericho. And smell is a very important, a very spiritual, the most spiritual sense in a way. And the scientists are onto this right now, that scent reaches a very deep part of the soul. People have memories connected to scent. They don't even realize that. But the point is that represents a very lofty spiritual state, and everybody achieves that, at least spiritually, in their own life. But you're right that in the broader context, maybe history has not played out yet. We're not in the promised land in the historic perspective, in the collective historic perspective, or even the national perspective of the Jewish people as people, and certainly not as humanity as a whole. But you could say that an individual person reached their own promised land, and the promised land, and technically it's not the promised land. Technically, it's the Jordan River. But in other words, it's the goal, it's the destination for the purpose of our discussion.
Okay, so there's two aspects here. One is that there's a completion that occurs in from Moshe, the fact that he and we make a have a completion of our lives. But when just like the wandering Jew is always used as a kind of something that's repeated, we're always getting to the promised land. It's always said, oh yeah, and then we're going to wander and then we'll get to the promised land. But that really isn't exactly right then, because the promised land implies a historical place, and maybe even the perfection of the world, where in fact what we're getting to is a resolution of our lives through the history of what we've been doing, through the journey, I guess.
Right. So I think what you're saying is two things. You're saying that that one is an individual story and then is the collective. But I also think that you touched upon something else, and that is ultimately there is no promised land. In other words, ultimately, the promised land is always elusive, because ultimately, if God is infinite, there's always growth. And that's what the sages say in the Talmud, that there's no rest. The Talmidei Chachamim, the scholars in heaven, ein lahem menucha, they have no rest, because they go from strength to strength. If you're talking about connection to God, it's not something you could say, I reached the destination, now I'm connected. Because there's always more to grow and always more to understand and always more to cleave, because God is infinite. So in a way, there is no ultimate promised land, and everything we're talking about is relative to my lifetime. This is the promised land. Relative to the state I am in now, the next step is the promised land, but that process ultimately will continue forever because God is infinite. So
when we have so it's essentially the Buddhists, and I don't know Buddhism, but I know that they have this concept of nirvana, which is supposed to be where you where everything gets to the point of oneness, and it's over. You're there,
right.
And
we don't have it there. We have oneness, but we don't have it there because it's infinite.
Because it's infinite, and the infinite. So we're always seeking the promised land, even at the end of our lifetime, so to speak.
We're always seeking and we're always getting, right? It's not just yearning. It's like inhaling and exhaling, right? So you're running and returning. So there's a moment of like you talk about Shabbat and the 6 days. Shabbat, for example, Shabbat in a small sense, Shabbat, the Talmud says Shabbat is the era of redemption. Why is Shabbat the era of redemption? World is not perfect. My life is not perfect. My finances are not perfect. My health is not perfect. But Shabbat is perfection. Why? because you have to see as if everything is done. There's nothing else to do, right? So Shabbat right now, celebrate what I have, right? So it's enjoying and pleasure everything that I have. Sunday will come around, and now there's a new Shabbat on the horizon. But it's not
Ah,
the whole Shabbat. It's not that my whole life I'm just yearning. That's the painful life. It's yearning and then quenching the thirsts, and then discovering the more you quench the thirst, the more you discover that there's more knowledge to be had, right? So every act of quenching is tomorrow morning makes you more thirsty. So it's an ongoing cycle, but it's not fair to say that we're just longing, and it's not fair to say that we reach the ultimate. There's a give and take here. It's back and forth. The Kabbalah would say Ratzav Hashuv, running and returning, which is yearning and being. And the 6 days is about striving, and Shabbat is about being. Right?
oh, that's really beautiful.
Yeah, yeah.
That's really cool. Thank you.
Look, I have to fix this. Just 1 second. I think I'm still. Oops. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. You've just presented something that I'd never thought about before, because it's always a sort of simplistic explanation of why it happened. So is the deeper Kabbalistic explanation of why Moses did not enter the promised land, and perhaps its relevance to us, is that the goal of life is not the arrival, but the journey, and that the end point is the process and not the goal.
So I would agree with that. I just would agree with that. I would agree with that to a sense. Of course, we want perfection. Of course, we want the goal. But the point is, there is meaning even if the goal is not reached.
No, but maybe the point is the goal was not reached very specifically. In other words, if we say, is there a real reason why Moses didn't get there? Because maybe the message to all of us is in the journey, and that Moses took the journey, and that if Moses got there, the issue would be, in a sense, winning, if that's the goal.
I agree. I agree.
Then the whole journey, and that maybe, in a sense, not winning is more important. But more important is that he went on this long journey, and maybe very specifically, it's important that he didn't get there, because if he got there, it would be like the whole purpose of it is to get to the goal, rather than the primary purpose is the journey itself.
I agree. I agree with that what you're saying in the formulation, and I agree with you. I just want to say that some people would say, because of what you're saying, in other words, they agree with you, and they would say, and therefore the Mashiach never comes. In other words, there will never be a Mashiach. They'll never reach a perfection because we're always in the journey. So what I want to say is we believe that eventually we'll reach some degree of perfection. But the point is, as you stated so beautifully, if Moshe reached his perfection, then an accomplished life would mean you have to win. You have to get to Israel. You have to get to the promised land. Now that Moshe, the greatest prophet who ever lived, did not reach the promised land, he only reached his promised land. That is an indicator for us that we too, our journey has meaning, even though we did not merit to see the ultimate perfection of humanity.
So maybe it's another spin on the notion in Judaism that according to the effort is the reward.
Right.
So in a sense, Moses made the effort, and his reward comes from the effort that he made, not that the reward was getting to Israel.
Right. I agree. I agree with that. I agree with that. And
I think what's interesting about you, what you just both just said, really, is that, the Shabbat moment, that Judaism is unique in that it has this place, a stopping point to stop for a second and enjoy the fruits of your labor, enjoy what you've done, and then move on. To say is and then so at that point you don't feel my life was meaningless at the end because something positive, occurred. If it's all just about the journey and then the journey ends with no purpose, then you feel a certain sense of loss and meaninglessness, I would think.
Ben is pushing back, and Ben is saying that we do reach a promised land in a sense. In other words, in a relative terms, we reached a promised land. In general, in the objective terms, we have not. right? My life is not perfect. Shabbos is coming in a few hours. My life will probably not be perfect. But if I really tune into Shabbat, my life is perfect. I have what I need. I'm healthy, relatively speaking. I have joy in my life, relatively speaking. It's relative perfection. And if you're not able to celebrate and enjoy and feel blessed with the relative perfection, you're going to have a bad life. And perfection is, I don't know if perfection is possible, but I'm just saying even completeness or pleasure, right? Pleasure means pleasure that is not burdened by worry and not burdened by what's going to happen tomorrow. Now, tomorrow, you should think about tomorrow. We're not saying don't think about the future, but we're saying on Shabbat, don't think about the future. On Shabbat, you reached your promised land. Have you reached the promised land? Of course not. But have you reached a relative degree of promised land? Yes. And if you don't know how to tap into that, then it's sad because your whole life is trying to achieve something that, but you're never living your life. You're always searching for the next step.
Rabbi, maybe Shabbat is like Deuteronomy. It won't take stock of the journey.
Yeah. So in a way, Friday night is more that time where, according to the Kabbalah, Malchut is coming back up, where you're sort of still trying to elevate and reframe the experiences of the rest of the week. But according to the Kabbalah, as you move on Shabbat afternoon, as Shabbat morning and then Shabbat afternoon, you're becoming more and more spiritual in the sense of not being traumatized by the experiences of the week. And Friday and Shabbat afternoon, the third meal is Raiva deriving the pleasure, will of will, which is really pleasure of pleasure, which is there's pleasure of overcoming hardship. That's one level of pleasure. And then there's ultimate pleasure, which is the state of I feel like I need nothing. I feel I'm perfect. We could talk about pleasure for a minute because pleasure is very interesting according to the Kabbalah. But this idea that Moshe, we're at the Jericho, we're at the Jordan River at Jericho. So the way the fourth book portrays it, we reached the goal. The way the fifth book portrays it, we did not. It is Joshua. The story continues, but the way it's being told in this parsha, we travel our whole life to the Jericho, and that's the relative promised land. And there's a collective promised land, which eventually we will merit. It's a principle of Jewish faith that the world is moving forward, and even if it looks like it's twisting and turning, but we're moving forward, and we're going to reach. We're optimistic that eventually we reach a time of I don't know if the word perfection is the perfect word, because perfection implies there's nowhere to grow, and I'm saying there is room to grow. But I mean peace, harmony, knowledge of God, and those are important steps. In other words, that's the promised land in the physical sense. So I think we touched upon a lot of points here. Let's talk about pleasure for one moment, and then we can talk about going back to reframing. So how do you define pleasure? So it's not such an easy thing to define, I don't think, but the Kabbalah will tell you that the deepest part of the soul is pleasure. In other words, there's will, there's the 10 sfirot. Above the 10 sfirot is the crown. 10 sfirot is sort of the 10 sfirot are the 10 traits of the soul, but it's also expressed in the anatomy of the body. And then you have above the body, you have the crown, keter, and crown represents will and pleasure. And the deepest part of the soul is pleasure. So why would pleasure be the deepest part of the soul? So in other words, the perfection is pleasure. So pleasure equals perfect, but we're not in a perfect world. So one way to think about this, and I once heard a Hasidic teacher saying this, and when he said it, it really resonated. And I said, you know what, I have to mark this down in my memory because I think this is powerful. Pleasure says that at this moment, I don't need anything. That's the definition of pleasure. At this moment, I don't need anything. And in a way, that's why it's the deepest place, because in a way, you're connecting to the only one perfect thing in the world, which is God, right? If I'm enjoying myself and I have pleasure because I'm sitting on my yacht and my yacht is 70 feet, and I look next to me and I see my friend's yacht is 90 feet, and I say, I'm enjoying it, but I wish I had the 90 foot. Then I move from pleasure to will and desire. And desire implies imperfection. Desire means I want something. I don't have everything I need. I don't have everything I want. I'm more ambitious. So it's very important skill to be ambitious. And if not, we would all still be living in the cave. So we're very happy that people have ambition and we have ambition. But the point is that is not connecting to the true essence of everything, which is the perfection. So pleasure, no matter what causes you the pleasure, I can have pleasure from drinking a little bit of wine. It's not that the wine is perfect. It's that wine helps me touch the part of my soul that is perfect. Now, because we're in the physical world, that feeling is fleeting. It only lasts for a second, right? And tomorrow I'm going to have more pleasure to get to that same place. But that's a different question. The different question is, how do I feel the feeling of perfection when my soul is in an imperfect world? And the answer is I cannot always feel it. But that still doesn't take away from the fact that part of me is perfect, part of me is pleasure, part of me is Shabbat. And on Shabbat, the job is to experience pleasure. And that's why all week when we eat, the service of God is that I eat in order that I should have energy to be able to serve God. But on Shabbat, the pleasure of the food itself is a service of God, because now I'm connecting to the idea of pleasure, which is the idea of perfection, which is the idea of the infinite, the God, which is the only perfect existence. So that's just something to think about how we move in the. So primarily, even though you're allowed to have pleasure in the 6 days of the week too, but primarily the 6 days of the week is not a time to sit and have pleasure, even though you could have. But I'm just saying the main work, it would be then more accomplishing, doing, building, refining, working. 6 days of labor. 6 days of labor. Labor implies will. Labor implies ambition. Labor implies journeying and growth. But Shabbat is not a time for growth, even spiritual growth. Even spiritual growth is the wrong word for Shabbat. Shabbat is not about growth. Shabbat is about pleasure. Shabbat is about connecting to that which we already have, finding the deepest part of ourselves that is connected to God and is perfect and is pleasurable and is joyous. So that's a little bit about the journey and the promised land and the not just the collective promised land, the individual promised land, and then and in some level, every Shabbat is the perfection. And in some levels, the Kabbalah says when you pray, it's the Shabbat of the weekday, right? So there's always the promised land. Everything basically, everything is relative. That's the bottom line. Relative to what? Did we reach the promised land? It depends. Relative to what? Okay, we'll do a few more minutes on the reframing. I'm going to read the first Rashi. Says the Rashi as follows, and we're going to share the screen. The long Rashi. And these are the journeys of the children of Israel who left the land of Egypt in their legions under the charge of Moses and Aaron. So we have a very long Rashi here. And the Rashi basically wants to say, why do I have to mention all 42 journeys? If you're really interested to know the places where the Jewish people journeyed, if you're interested, not saying you should be interested, but if you're interested, go look in the last 3 books and write down every time it says the Jewish people rested, and you'll have all the places. Why do you have to recount it now? So Rashi says there must be a reason. And Rashi gives 2 reasons. The first one is more technical, and the second one is more spiritual. The first technical reason is because the Jewish people, to tell you that God loves us. And even though he says we're going to wander in the desert, he didn't say the word wander, but even though he says we're going to be shifting and drifting back and forth in the desert, we didn't really do much traveling. Well, how so? Rashi does the math that there's 42 journeys. Many of them, almost 10 were in the first year. Almost 10 were in the last year. So now you have 20 journeys over 38 years. And over those 38 years, you were in one place for almost 19 years. Basically, they weren't running around a lot. There weren't a lot of traveling. Most people in the modern world, they move a few times every decade. They're moving more than the Jewish people journeyed. So in other words, the first interpretation of Rashi is it's to tell us that God's kindness, that even though he said we're going to be shifting back and forth, we were not rushing. It was much more tranquil than you would imagine in the popular imagination. So that's the first part of Rashi, and Rashi brings all those verses to back this up. So I'm just going to read the first 3 lines, then we'll skip to the second interpretation. Says Rashi, these are the journeys. Says Rashi, why were these journeys recorded? In other words, we already know. We want to know where they were. Go look back in the last 3 books and chart the trail of how they journeyed. So Rashi says, to inform us of the kind deeds of the omnipresent. For although he issued a decree to move them around from place to place and make them wander in the desert, I said wander, but this is a translation. Lahania means to move them around. There's no word wander. I'm sticking by this. In any case, lahani is to move. But in other words, Though Tamar, you should not say that they were moving about and wandering from station to station for all 40 years. And they had no rest. And Rashi does the math that because there were only 42 stages, deduct 14 of them, for they all took place in the first year, before the decree from when they journeyed from Ramses until they arrived in Ritma, from where the spies were sent. Okay, this is proof. So in other words, 14, I made a mistake, 14 of in the first year. Subtract further 8 stages, which took place after Aaron's death from Mount Hor to the plains of Moab during the 40th year. So we have 14, then we have 8, that's 22 journeys in 2 years. And the other 38 years, they only did 18 stops. Okay. And you will find, okay. And I will, okay. And you will find that throughout the 38 years, they made only 20 journeys. Why 20? Oh, because it's 42, of course. It's 42, not 40. Okay. So there's 42. So in 38 years, they traveled 20 stops. So all of this, the key is to inform us of the kind deeds of the omnipresent. That's why all these were recounted. That's one interpretation. The second interpretation is another medrash, which is a little bit more, I don't know what the word is, nuanced. Okay. So Rashi says, I found this commentary of Rab Moshe Hardarshan, the preacher, Medrash Agada. Says this, everything I said till now was from Moshe Hardarshan, Moshe the preacher. Moshe, that was one of the names of the sages of the Medrash. Then he says, Rabbi Tanchuma expounds it in another way. There's another perspective. What's the other perspective? It's not talking about the kindness of God. It's a different perspective. What is it? It is analogous to a king whose son became sick. So he took them to a faraway place to have him healed. So in other words, let's say there's a metaphor: a child is sick, and the father takes the son to travel on the journey to go heal him. So maybe there's a hospital in Texas. So we travel all the way from New York State to Texas. Okay. Now, on the way back, the father began citing all the stages of their journey, saying to him, this is where we sat. Here we were cold. Here you had a headache, etc. So in other words, on the way back of the journey, the father, it tells the son, oh, you remember, this is where we did all these stuff. Here we were cold. Here we sat. I don't know why it says we sat. Yashana means we slept. Here we slept. Here we were cold, or we cooled down. Here you had a headache, etc. So that's a very nice metaphor. And basically the metaphor says, on the way back of the journey, you're telling what happened. So there's a lot to talk about this metaphor. The Rebbe analyzes this metaphor, every detail of this metaphor, takes it apart and gives very deep insight. But I just want to start with some big ideas in this metaphor. The first metaphor is the entire journey is for healing. Now that's a very big chidush. That's a novelty, right? So I want to look at the Tanchuma expounds it, and it is analogous to a king whose son became sick, so he took him from a faraway place to have him healed. Okay, so in other words, when you look at those 42 steps, you don't always see healing. To the contrary, you see some of those steps are places where, as we mentioned, as you know, where there were complaints and there were sins and there were setbacks, and yet. Right now, the way it's being defined in Rashi at the end of the journey, how do you define this journey? It wasn't a journey where we got into trouble. It wasn't a journey where we became sick. It was a journey for healing. And that's a very important point, consistent with what we've been saying all morning, that the setback is part of the growth and the distraction is part of the growth. So that's the first big idea. Then we have to talk about another important point, which is the reframing, which we'll get to in a minute. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
Rabbi, is there a reason why the focus is on the stops or the journeys rather than the focus being on what was learned from each step on the journey? Because ultimately it's not about travel. I mean, if we chronicle and talked about ourselves, we could tell we went to Paris, we went to Rome, we went to India, we went here. But really what's important is not the places we visited or the restaurants we ate at, or the hotels we stayed at. The question is, how did we grow from each step along the way? Now, don't our great commentators talk about the meaning and the learning and the transformation resulting from each stop?
The answer is yes. And the answer is yes. And just to put it another way, the places are not important. What's important is the experiences.
Yes.
Right. So even if you look at the metaphor, and look at what Rashi is using with this metaphor, he doesn't say here we were in this place or that place. He says that here we sat, here we were cold, here you had a headache. In other words, he's talking about the experiences. He's not saying here we were in Paris and here we were in London. He's saying here we had this experience, there we had that experience. All these three scenarios are going to be explained by the Rebbe, and the Hasidic masters talk about many of the journeys and explain what they represent. But the short answer is you're correct. Even though the Torah seems to be saying just names of places, as you point out, make no mistake, it's not just the name of a place; it's a metaphor for an experience, and that happens often. And the Torah name, and it's also true that many times the place is named because of the experience, right? So some of the places get their name because of the experience. Now, there's another whole genre where some of the names are negative names, but the Hasidic commentary says it could be negative, it could be positive. For example, the best example was the Baal Shem Tov. One of the places are called Kivrot HaTa'ava, the burial of the people who desired or lusted. And the problem was that people there complained that they wanted meat, and God brought them meat, but God was very upset, so some people died, and they buried the people who desired meat, and they called that place Kivrot HaTa'ava, the burial of the desire. And so you look at that story is just negative. So in our life, it looks like it's a negative stop. But the Baal Shem Tov says, no, that same experience could be interpreted differently. There, the desire was buried. Not they buried the ones who desired, but the negative desire was buried. And it could be a spiritual state, a state of people realizing that what they desired for actually does not bring them the meaning and the joy that they thought it would. And they mature to the point that now that's not what they want other things. And the negative desire has been buried. So the short answer is that yes, we're referring to experiences, and the experiences happen at certain places, but those experiences are what's important. Yeah. Okay.
Therefore, Rabbi, perhaps what is most important isn't the place at all, but what was gained from the place. And sometimes a really negative experience is best remembered because we learn the most from it.
Correct. And that's so we're gonna hopefully we'll get to that in a moment. Yes. Go ahead, Ben. Oh, I don't know if you. Okay. So now is one more point of the metaphor, and I think we'll conclude with that. Maybe we'll finish a few minutes early here because we're not going to have time to enter the essay in a detailed way. But what's very interesting about this metaphor, and I've said this in the past years, so you may remember, but part of this metaphor, so let's see the problem with the metaphor. Often you look at the metaphor and you try to compare it, and the point where the metaphor doesn't make sense is really where all the wisdom is. So let me try to explain what I mean. Case in point. So what is the metaphor? It is analogous to a king whose son became sick, so he took him to a faraway place to have him healed. On the way back, now we have a problem. So what's the metaphor? The metaphor is, let's say we're in New York and we want to go to a hospital in Houston. So we travel those thousands of miles. I think it's more than 1,000 miles. Yeah. So you're traveling all those miles, and then the metaphor is on the way back. As they go back, they reach every step, and that's a beautiful metaphor. The problem with the metaphor is that it does not apply to what the Jewish people were experiencing. Why? Because the Jewish people started out at point A, which is Egypt. They end up Jordan River opposite Jericho. They never go back. So why is Rashi quoting the Medrash, bringing an analogy of a father taking a son, traveling from point A to point B, but then going back to point A? How you chayzen they were going back if the Jewish people never went back? Why say they went back? That's the question. That's the Rebbe's question. It's a very beautiful question. And the answer is even more profound, especially if you think about that the Medrash was written before this term in psychology was invented. The answer is we are going back. Maybe not literally, but figuratively. In other words, when you are in the painful experience, you cannot say that this is part of the healing, because the pain itself is negative. And we're not here to say that the negative is positive. No. So on the way there, on the journey, the first time around the journey, there are negative stops on the journey. There's nothing you can do about that because we're in an imperfect world, and God places us in difficult situations. And as we'll see, if you want to talk about it specifically, we also make the problem worse. Sometimes we sin beyond just the challenges that God places us in. So on the way there, there's pain. But then the point is, after you to have that experience, if you turn back and you ask yourself the question that Dr. Tamarin asked, which is, how do I grow from that experience? you're now reframing that experience. Now that experience does not mean what it was before. Before it was negative. Now it's a negative that leads to something positive. But the point is, very often, in the moment of pain, in the moment of separation, in the moment of difficulty, there is no positive. You can't say I got into a fight with you and that's positive. No, you could say after I got into a fight, I felt bad and I reached out and I actually deepened the relationship. But that's afterward. So the point here is after the experience, you actually do go back because you can redefine that negative experience. So maybe when it happened, it was negative. But Rashi specifically quotes the Medrash that specifically uses a metaphor of going back, even though technically they didn't go back, because the answer is we have to go back and reclaim those negative experiences and say, how has that made me a better person? And when we do, then the entire journey, including the negative steps, are actually part of healing. So that's the pitch. Go ahead, Dr. Tamron.
Rabbi, can we connect this with something that you've taught us a lot about the greater significance of the question than the answer? And that what is important is not the answer, which is the arrival, but the journey. And there's an old joke which goes as follows. A boy goes to Washington with his father, and he points at the Washington Monument. He says, "What's that?" He says, "I don't know." And he goes to the Lincoln Monument. He says, "What's that?" He says, "I don't know." He goes to the White House. He says, "I don't know." So basically, this kid says to his father, "Do you mind my asking all these questions?" He says, "Of course not, son. If you don't ask questions, how do you expect to get answers?" And the real issue is the answer isn't even important. It's important that the kid is asking the questions, and what's important is the journey, and what's important is that we keep asking questions, and that in a way, do our great commentators give answers, or do they more or less ask questions?
So the way a Jew always answers the question with a question.
Sure, that's the point.
So the point is that you're always giving. This is a joke. Why do Jews ask me why Jews always answer a question with a question?
Why did you, Rabbi? Why did Jews always answer a question with a question?
Why not? Right.
Well, I know that's the joke, but the real answer is because in the question lies the meaning.
Yeah. So the
meaning
answer
comes not from the answer, but from asking the question.
I agree. But part of asking questions is not taking things for granted and being able to look for the deeper meaning. And part of that is when you look back at a negative experience, you could either be a victim of that experience. Let's say it was made by you. In other words, let's say it's beyond my control is one scenario, or even if more radical, even if I contributed to this negative experience and I made a mess. Sometimes I mess up. What are you going to do? I made a mess. And now there's a mess. And now there's pain. And now there's illness. Okay. Now the question is how it's up to me whether this remains a place of negativity and illness, or if I choose to go back and ask the right questions. And again, the answer is only as good as the question. If you ask the wrong questions, you're going to get the wrong answer. Sometimes people come to therapy and the question is, who could I blame? And if I'm asking that question, you'll get a lot of good answers, but you're not going to transform that situation into growth. But if the question is, what can I learn from that experience? How can I become a better person from that experience? Then I'm going back to that same space, not physically, but metaphorically, and I'm reclaiming. You could say reframing, reclaim, do it depending on what exactly we're doing. But the point here is by asking the right questions, I actually could transform, not be a victim of that scenario, even of a scenario that I myself created. But now I could say, if I ask myself, how do I grow from that? How do I change myself or perfect myself or learn from that? Now, what was a stop that was a painful experience, now on the way back became healing. On the way there, I'm not sure it was healing, but on the way back, meaning when I revisit, that's when it's healing. So that's very profound because it's also very empowering, because there are negative experiences that we have in our life, A, that are not in our control, B, that were in our control, but we made a mistake. And those consequences, in some cases, cannot be reversed. Sometimes that's the nature of the world we live in. We make a mistake and you can't reverse, you can't turn the wheel back. So you could say, that's all negative. Or you could say, maybe I can't turn the wheel back in the literal sense. I can't go back and recreate the scenario, but I can have personal growth. In other words, I have grown. I am not the same person, and I have been healed. And that happens through, at the end of the journey or after the pain, being able to look back and asking those right same questions, and Father telling the Son, here's what happened. Here's how you think about what happened in your life. And that's the big picture. Of course, we can get into the specifics, but I think for right now, this is something to think about.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, then. Thank you.